The alarm on the council chamber wall turned red before anyone had spoken a single word. I felt it in my chest before I understood it in my mind. That low pulse of light meant only one thing in 300 years of service. A species was about to break its bond with the council forever. I gripped the edge of my seat and looked across the chamber floor at Elena Ward, the human ambassador, standing perfectly still, while every eye in that vast hall turned toward her. My name is Veltharian Osk, and I had represented the Cathari Concord on this council since before Elena Ward was born. I had watched 1,000 debates rise and fall in this chamber. I had never once believed I would watch a species walk out of it. Elena did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The silence itself was louder than any shout. She said that humanity had asked for nothing but a seat at the table where decisions were made about their own worlds, their own ships, their own lives. She said that for 60 years, humanity had answered every call for help. When the Veyron plague spread through 3 star systems, human medical ships arrived before any council vessel had even finished its committee review. When the outer colonies burned during the great storms of the Dravon Belt, it was human engineers who rebuilt the shield towers, working without pay, without thanks, without a vote. She said humanity had given everything and asked only to be treated as an equal. And every time, the council found a reason to say not yet. I remember the sound that followed her words. It was laughter. Soft, amused, dismissive laughter from the elder benches, from species who had sat on this council for 10,000 years and measured time the way a human measures a single afternoon. Councillor Threl Vantorio, a tall, silver-skinned elder of the Corvain Assembly, leaned toward his neighbor and said just loud enough for the chamber to hear that humanity made up less than 1% of the council's combined military strength, and surely a species so small could not walk away from the only body that gave them meaning in this galaxy. I did not laugh. Something in me went very quiet and very cold. Elena did not answer the laughter. She simply looked at each of the elder delegates in turn, one by one, as if she were memorizing their faces for something she planned to write down later. Then she folded the small data tablet in her hand, tucked it beneath her arm, and turned to leave. Behind her, the rest of the human delegation rose together. I counted them, 17 humans, diplomats and aides, and one young translator who could not have been older than 25, all standing at once, all walking toward the great doors without a single word of protest, without a single gesture of anger. I wanted to call out. I wanted to say, wait, do not do this. Let us talk further. Let us find a middle path the way we always have. But my throat closed around the words, and I said nothing, and I have regretted that silence every day since. The doors of the council chamber are ancient, cut from a single slab of hallowed stone, brought from the founding world 4,000 years ago. I had seen them open 1,000 times for arrivals, for greetings, for celebrations. I had never seen them close behind a departure that felt so final. When the doors sealed, the chamber erupted into noise. Some delegates cheered, actually cheered, as if a great burden had been lifted from the council's shoulders. Others murmured uneasily, glancing at each other with the particular discomfort of beings who suspect they have made a mistake but are too proud to say it aloud. Councillor Threl Vantorio stood and addressed the chamber with a satisfied smile stretched across his narrow face. He said that the council would continue exactly as it always had, that humanity's absence would barely register within a single council cycle, that the younger species always overestimated their own importance in the grand architecture of the galaxy. I looked at the empty seats where the human delegation had been sitting only minutes before. 17 empty chairs in a chamber built for thousands. It should have meant nothing. It should have been a small gap, easily filled by the next agenda item. Instead, I felt something shift beneath the floor of that chamber, some deep structural weight, quietly sliding out of place, the way a bridge groans softly moments before anyone notices the crack spreading across its foundation. I did not know then how right that feeling would turn out to be. That evening, I walked the long promenade outside the council spire alone, watching the traffic of 1,000 different starships moving through the orbital lanes above the capital world. Ships from 30 founding species, ships carrying grain and medicine and diplomats and children returning home from school on distant moons. Somewhere among that traffic, human ships were already turning away, already setting new courses, already leaving orbits they had shared with the Council for 6 decades. My aide, a quiet young Kethari named Soren Daxa, found me there and asked if I believed the humans would return within the month, the way disgruntled delegations sometimes did after tempers cooled. I told him I did not know, but I told him something else too, something I had not said aloud to anyone. I told him that in 60 years of watching humanity sit at that table, I had never once seen them ask for privilege. I had only ever seen them ask for fairness, and a species that asks only for fairness and is refused again and again does not usually come back asking a second time. Soren did not understand what I meant. I barely understood it myself. But that night, lying awake in my quarters while starlight crossed my ceiling in slow-moving patterns, I found myself thinking not about council protocol or diplomatic precedent, but about Elena Ward's face as she looked at the elder delegates one final time. There had been no anger in her expression. There had been something far heavier than anger. There had been the quiet, settled grief of someone who had already mourned a friendship long before it ended, and was only now allowing herself to say goodbye. I did not sleep well that night, and I would sleep far worse in the nights that followed, though I could not yet imagine how much worse things were about to become. The following morning, the council reconvened as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Delegates filed into the chamber discussing trade routes and agricultural quotas, the ordinary business of a galaxy that assumed it would simply continue turning the way it always had. I sat in my seat and stared at the empty section where the human delegation used to gather, 17 chairs polished and waiting, and I found it strange that nobody else seemed to notice how loudly that emptiness spoke. Councillor Threll Vantorio opened the session by proposing that the human seats be reassigned to a waiting list of smaller species eager for representation, as though the departure were simply an administrative convenience rather than a wound. Several delegates murmured approval. I felt something rise in my chest that I had not felt in a very long time, something close to shame, though shame for what exactly I could not yet name. I asked to speak, and the chamber granted me the floor with the mild impatience reserved for delegates who insist on prolonging a session everyone else considers finished. I asked the assembly whether anyone present had actually read Elena Ward's final address in full, rather than simply remembering the laughter that followed it. I asked whether anyone had reviewed the record of proposals humanity had submitted over the past decade, the ones quietly buried in committee, the ones that never reached a formal vote at all. Nobody answered me directly. Councillor Vantorio simply suggested, with a thin smile, that I was allowing sentiment to cloud sound judgment, and that the council had weathered far greater departures in its long history without difficulty. He reminded the chamber that the Dravon Assembly had once withdrawn for 11 years during a border dispute, and the council had continued to function without incident. I did not argue further that day, though I left the chamber troubled in a way I had not expected. I went instead to the archive wing beneath the council spire, a quiet, half-forgotten place where old records were stored long after anyone thought to consult them, and I began pulling files myself, one after another, searching for every human proposal submitted over the past 20 years. It took me 3 full days to read through everything I found: proposals for shared research access to the ancient Veyron star charts, denied on procedural grounds, proposals for a formal seat on the Disaster Response Council, tabled twice and then quietly removed from the agenda entirely. A request, submitted only 18 months earlier, simply asking that human casualties in council service be recorded with the same formal honors given to founding species personnel. That request had been rejected by a narrow vote, on the grounds that expanding honorary recognition to non-founding species might dilute the significance of the tradition. I sat with that last file for a long time, thinking of every human engineer and pilot and medic who had died quietly in council service over the decades, their names recorded in ordinary administrative logs rather than the honored memorial that founding species personnel received. I thought of how small that request had been, how easily it could have been granted, and how deliberately it had been refused instead. I brought these files to Soren that evening, spreading them across the table in my quarters, and he read through them in silence, his expression growing heavier with each page. When he finally looked up at me, he asked a simple question. He asked whether I believed the council had done this on purpose, out of malice, or simply out of habit, the kind of thoughtlessness that grows comfortable after enough centuries of never being questioned. I told him I did not think it mattered which one was true. The outcome for the people affected had been exactly the same either way. I thought often, during those first difficult days, about a memory from many years earlier, long before Elena Ward ever became ambassador. I remembered a young human aide, barely out of training, who had once approached me after a session to ask, politely and a little nervously, why human proposals so rarely reached the floor for a full vote. I remembered giving her a practiced, diplomatic answer about procedural timing and committee workload, an answer I had given so many times before that I had stopped noticing how hollow it sounded. I did not remember her name. I wished now that I had. It was during this same week that word reached the council of the first quiet consequence of humanity's absence, though at the time it seemed like nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence, easily explained away. A supply convoy bound for a small agricultural colony on the edge of Veyron space arrived 4 days behind schedule, its usual human escort replaced at the last moment by an unfamiliar crew unfamiliar with the route's specific hazards. Nothing disastrous happened. The convoy simply arrived late, and the colony's harvest festival had to be postponed by a few days. It seemed like such a small thing. I remember thinking, at the time, that perhaps Councillor Vantorio was right after all, that the galaxy would simply absorb humanity's absence the way it absorbed every other change, smoothly, quietly, without lasting consequence. I did not yet understand that small things, left unattended long enough, have a way of becoming very large things indeed. The first sign came 11 days later, and it arrived not as an announcement but as a silence, the kind of silence that takes time to notice, because it hides inside something that used to be so constant nobody thought to listen for it. The relay station above the Corvain frontier had been humming quietly for 6 years, carrying communications between 42 star systems along the outer trade routes. It had been built jointly, funded by the Council, but maintained almost entirely by a small human engineering crew who had taken the assignment when no other species wanted the long, unglamorous, thankless posting so far from the capital worlds. I learned of the silence from Soren, who burst into my office one morning with a report clutched in both hands, his expression somewhere between confusion and alarm. He said the Corvain relay had gone dark, not destroyed, not damaged, simply unattended. The human maintenance crew had completed their contract, packed their equipment, and departed 3 days earlier, and no replacement crew had been assigned because no replacement crew had ever been necessary before. I remember asking him a simple question: who else knows how to maintain that relay? Soren did not have an answer, neither did the Council's infrastructure office, when I contacted them directly. Neither did the Corvain Assembly, who owned the relay on paper but had never once sent an engineer to service it. For 6 years, the entire weight of that critical communication network had rested quietly on human shoulders, unpaid overtime and unclaimed credit, and nobody in the Council's grand architecture had thought to ask what would happen if those shoulders were no longer available. Within a week, 3 of the 42 systems along that trade route lost contact with the capital entirely. Cargo shipments stalled. A medical transport carrying vaccines to a colony recovering from a crop blight had to reroute through a slower, older channel, arriving 4 days late. The colony's governor filed a formal complaint with the Council, demanding to know why the relay network had failed so suddenly. Nobody in the Council chamber wanted to answer that question honestly. I watched Counselor Threll Vantorio stand before the assembly and explain, with visible discomfort, that the relay network required specialized maintenance protocols that the Corvain assembly was, and I quote his exact words, currently in the process of reacquiring. Reacquiring. As if humanity's expertise had simply misplaced itself somewhere in a storage closet, waiting patiently to be found again. I pressed the infrastructure office further, asking directly how long it would take to train a replacement crew capable of maintaining a relay network as complex as the Corvain station. The answer, when it finally came, was not reassuring. The office estimated at least 2 years of specialized training before any replacement engineers could safely take over full maintenance duties, and even then, only with ongoing guidance from someone who already understood the system's particular quirks that existed only in the memory of the human crew who had already left. I asked whether anyone had thought to simply contact that crew and offer them a proper contract, formal recognition, fair compensation for their years of unpaid work, in exchange for training a new team before the network failed completely. Counselor Vantorio waved the suggestion aside almost before I had finished speaking, insisting that reopening negotiations with a departed delegation would send precisely the wrong message to the rest of the galaxy, a message of weakness the Council could not afford to project during such a delicate transition. I left that meeting convinced, for the first time, that pride had become more important to some members of this Council than the actual welfare of the systems they claimed to govern. Within a week, 3 of the 42 systems along that trade route lost contact with the capital entirely. Cargo shipments stalled. A medical transport carrying vaccines to a colony recovering from a crop blight had to reroute through a slower, older channel, arriving 4 days late. The colony's governor filed a formal complaint with the Council, demanding to know why the relay network had failed so suddenly. Nobody in the Council chamber wanted to answer that question honestly. I watched Counselor Threll Vantorio stand before the assembly and explain, with visible discomfort, that the relay network required specialized maintenance protocols that the Corvain assembly was, and I quote his exact words, currently in the process of reacquiring. I began paying closer attention after that, and the pattern only deepened the longer I looked. Human relief convoys, which had quietly answered 90% of the Council's disaster requests over the past 2 decades, simply stopped appearing on the emergency logs. Soren compiled a second chart for me that week, this one tracking response times across every recorded emergency call over the previous month. Where average response time had once been measured in hours, it was now stretching into days, sometimes longer, as the remaining founding species scrambled to cover territory they had never been responsible for before. I remember a smaller crisis during that same stretch, one that never made it into any official casualty report, but that stayed with me all the same. A passenger liner suffered an engine failure near a quiet trading outpost on the edge of Dravon space, stranding nearly 400 travelers, including several families with young children, for almost 3 days while the Council debated which fleet held jurisdiction to respond. A human rescue vessel would once have simply gone, without waiting for jurisdiction to be settled, because that had always been the quiet, unspoken understanding among human crews: help first, paperwork later. No such vessel existed to answer this call anymore, and the passengers sat cold and frightened until a Dravon patrol finally arrived, its captain later admitting privately to Soren that he had never trained for a rescue of that scale and had improvised most of the operation from outdated manuals. It was against this backdrop that the volcanic eruption struck the mining colony in the outer belt, burying 3 settlements under ash within a matter of hours and cutting off power and breathable air to nearly 6,000 colonists. The Council issued an emergency call for aid, the same call that would once have summoned a human convoy within hours, fully equipped and already familiar with that colony's particular terrain from previous responses. This time, the call went unanswered for 11 long days, until a smaller, slower fleet from the Veyron systems finally arrived, poorly equipped and unfamiliar with the ashfall patterns that made rescue operations there so uniquely dangerous. 42 colonists died waiting for help that in years past would have already been there. I remember exactly where I was when that casualty report reached the council chamber, and I remember the flat, administrative tone in which the number was read aloud, as though it were simply another line item in a routine briefing. I looked around the chamber to see whether anyone else felt the weight of it the way I did. A few delegates lowered their eyes. Most did not. I want to be honest here, because honesty is the only thing I have left to offer after everything that followed. The council did not fall apart because humanity left in anger, or because they sabotaged anything, or because they withdrew any resource out of spite. The council began to fall apart because humanity had quietly been holding up more of the galaxy's daily function than anyone, including the humans themselves, had ever openly acknowledged. And when that quiet, unclaimed labor disappeared, the gaps it left behind were enormous, and nobody else had built the muscles to fill them. In the days that followed the casualty report, the council chamber grew tense in a way I had never witnessed before. Delegates who had previously spoken to each other with practiced civility now traded sharp words across the floor, each species blaming another for the slow response, none willing to accept that the true failure belonged to an institution that had spent decades taking a single species for granted. I watched a young Veyron delegate named Edward Lang, newly appointed and still unfamiliar with the chamber's old rhythms, stand and ask plainly why the council had never built a redundant relief network in the first place, one that did not depend so heavily on any single species. Nobody answered him directly, and he sat back down looking more troubled than when he had stood. I began to notice, during this period, a quiet shift in how the younger delegates spoke. Delegates from smaller species who had spent their careers watching the elder benches make decisions without ever truly listening to anyone beneath them. They did not celebrate humanity's absence the way Councillor Vantorio once predicted they might. Instead, they watched the council's failures with a kind of grim recognition, as though seeing, perhaps for the first time, exactly how replaceable their own contributions had always been considered as well. Soren mentioned to me one evening that a handful of smaller species had begun quietly reaching out to human contacts through unofficial channels, not to negotiate on the council's behalf, but simply to ask whether the Sol Compact might be open to future cooperation, independent of whatever the council eventually decided to do. I did not report this to the assembly immediately. I wanted to understand it fully first, and I suspected, even then, that it represented something far larger than a single diplomatic curiosity. Around this same time, a delegation from a small agricultural species on the council's western border requested a private audience with me, having heard through informal channels that I had traveled to Sol space and returned with something other than the usual dismissive report. Their senior representative told me plainly that her people had watched humanity's departure with quiet, uncomfortable recognition because they too had spent generations offering labor and loyalty to the council in exchange for promises of protection that rarely seemed to materialize when it mattered most. She asked whether I believed the council could truly change or whether her people should begin preparing, quietly and carefully, for a future outside it. I did not have a confident answer for her that day, though her question stayed with me through every session of the difficult year that followed. I requested a formal assessment posting to human space. I told the council I wished to understand humanity's intentions, whether this was a temporary protest or a permanent severance, whether there remained any path toward reconciliation. Privately, I had another reason. I needed to see with my own eyes whether humanity was building something out of spite, the way Councillor Vantorio predicted, gathering strength to one day return and demand tribute for their absence. The council approved my request reluctantly, more out of a need to be seen taking some kind of action than any real faith in what I might accomplish. Soren asked to come with me. I agreed, glad not to make the journey alone. The trip to Sol space took 19 days by the fastest available transport, a journey I spent mostly reviewing old council records, searching for every human proposal that had ever come before that chamber. I found more than I expected. Proposals for shared colonial governance, quietly voted down by a narrow margin. Proposals for equal representation on the Emergency Response Council, tabled indefinitely 3 separate times over 8 years. A proposal, only 2 years old, asking simply that human engineers receive formal recognition and fair compensation for relay maintenance work they had been performing without official contract. That last proposal had been rejected unanimously by the elder delegates, on the grounds that formalizing the arrangement would set an unwelcome precedent for other junior species seeking similar recognition. I sat with that record for a long time. I thought about the Corvain relay, dark and silent, and the colonists who had died waiting for help. I thought about Elena Ward's face as she looked at the delegates one last time before walking out. When we finally arrived in Sol space, I expected to find hostility, perhaps even a fortified border, the posture of a wounded species preparing its defenses. Instead, I found something I had not prepared myself for at all. I found a wide, open, thriving network of new settlements, new trade routes, and new alliances forming, with a speed that should not have been possible for a species barely 6 weeks removed from the only galactic body they had ever known. Soren, standing beside me at the observation deck as our shuttle descended toward the surface, said quietly that it did not look like a species licking its wounds. I did not answer him, because I was thinking the exact same thought, and I did not yet have the words for how unsettling and how strangely hopeful that realization made me feel. The settlement they called New Haven bore no resemblance to what I had imagined during the long journey from Council space. I had pictured something grim, defensive, built in haste and fear, the architecture of a species bracing for retaliation. Instead, I found wide-open plazas filled with sunlight, gardens planted along every walkway, and construction crews working not with the frantic urgency of fear, but with the steady, purposeful rhythm of people building something meant to last. As our shuttle descended, I noticed something else that struck me deeply, though it took me a moment to understand why. Every building bore a small plaque near its entrance, listing not just its purpose, but the names of everyone who had helped construct it, engineers and laborers and planners alike, regardless of species or rank. Soren pointed this out to me quietly, remarking that in 3 centuries of visiting council worlds, he had never once seen a public building credit its workers by name. I had no answer for him. I simply filed the observation away, one small detail among many that would come to matter far more than I first realized. Nathan Pierce, the colony administrator who greeted our shuttle, was a broad-shouldered man with an easy smile and tired eyes that suggested he had not slept properly in weeks, though not from worry. He shook my hand, an old human custom I had learned long ago, and told me that the council delegation was welcome to see whatever we wished to see. He said humanity had nothing to hide, because humanity was not planning anything against the council at all. I asked him directly what humanity was planning instead. He led us through the settlement, rather than answering immediately, past workshops where engineers were assembling new relay technology, past a large hall where representatives from 3 other species sat in open discussion around a long table, past a school where children studied alongside young ones from a small refugee population I recognized as belonging to a synthetic collective the council had refused full citizenship for over a decade. He explained, as we walked, that humanity was building what he called the Soul Compact, a coalition open to any species the council had dismissed, delayed, or overlooked. Not a rival empire, he insisted, not a fortress preparing for a fight. Simply a partnership among those who had been told, in one way or another, that they did not yet deserve a seat at the table. I asked him whether this compact intended to one day challenge the council directly. He stopped walking and looked at me with an expression that held no anger at all, only a kind of tired honesty. He said humanity had spent 60 years trying to earn a seat through patience, through service, through quiet, unrewarded labor. He said they had learned, finally, that patience without respect simply becomes exploitation, dressed up in politeness. The compact was not built to challenge the council. It was built because waiting had stopped being a reasonable option. Nathan introduced us, as we continued walking, to a young woman named Sophie Marsh, one of the engineers who had spent 6 years maintaining the Corvain relay before her contract quietly ended and she returned home. She did not seem bitter when she spoke of it. She simply explained, in plain and measured words, that she had loved the work, had taken pride in keeping those 42 systems connected, and had simply reached a point where doing it for free, year after year, without so much as a formal acknowledgement from the assembly that owned the station, no longer felt like generosity. It felt, she said, like being taken for granted by people who had never once bothered to learn her name. I asked her whether she would ever consider returning to that work, under different terms. She considered the question seriously, rather than dismissing it, and told me she might, if the council ever offered a real contract, real recognition, and a genuine seat at the table where decisions about that relay's future were made. She said she did not want gratitude, she wanted partnership. I found myself unable to argue that this was an unreasonable thing to want. We passed, a little further on, a wide training yard where a mixed group of humans and members of the synthetic collective were drilling together on emergency response procedures, rehearsing evacuation drills for colonies that might one day need help the council could no longer reliably provide. Nathan explained that the compact had already begun assembling its own relief network, smaller than the council's old system, but growing quickly, built on volunteers who wanted their labor to be seen and valued from the very beginning, rather than discovered only after it disappeared. That afternoon, I met Elena Ward again in a small garden behind the settlement's central hall, where she was tending to a row of plants with her sleeves rolled up and dirt on her hands, looking nothing like the composed ambassador I remembered from the council chamber. She recognized me immediately and did not seem surprised to see me. She invited me to sit with her among the plants, and for a long while neither of us spoke, and I found that silence more honest than most of the speeches I had heard across 3 centuries of council sessions. When she finally spoke, she told me she did not feel triumphant. She told me that people back on council worlds probably imagined humanity celebrating its independence, laughing at the chaos left behind, but she said the truth was far quieter and far sadder than that. She said every relay station that went dark, every colony that waited too long for help, every life lost in the gap humanity left behind, weighed on her more heavily than anything the council itself had ever put upon her shoulders. She said she had not left the council out of anger. She had left because she finally understood that the council would never willingly share power, no matter how much humanity gave, no matter how many lives humanity saved, no matter how many decades humanity waited patiently for an invitation that was never coming. I asked her honestly whether there was any path back. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. She said the Sol Compact was not interested in going back to what things had been. She said it was interested in something new, something built on equal footing rather than gratitude and patience. She said if the council ever wanted a genuine partnership, humanity would listen. But she said the council would first have to prove, through action rather than apology, that it understood what it had actually lost. I left that garden with more questions than I had arrived with, but one thing had become clear to me beyond any doubt. This was not a species preparing for conflict. This was a species that had simply stopped waiting to be given what it had already earned. Before returning to our quarters that evening, Soren and I walked through the settlement's central market, a wide-open space filled with vendors from at least 6 different species, trading goods and stories with an easy familiarity I had rarely witnessed even in the oldest council capitals. An elderly synthetic trader, one of the collective Nathan had mentioned earlier, noticed our council markings and approached us without hesitation, curious rather than hostile. She told us, through a small translation device clipped to her chassis, that her people had waited 19 years for the council to grant them even provisional citizenship, only to be told each time that further study was required. She said the Sol Compact had granted her people full standing within 4 months of the first conversation. I asked her whether she resented the council for the years of waiting. She said resentment was a heavy thing to carry, and she preferred to spend her remaining years building something new rather than mourning something that had never truly welcomed her people in the first place. I did not have a response to that. I simply thanked her for her honesty and walked on, the weight of her words settling somewhere deep in my chest. Further along the market, A small crowd had gathered around a group of human children, performing a simple play for their families. A story about explorers finding a new home after a long and difficult journey. Soren and I stopped to watch for a while, and I found myself struck by how ordinary it all felt. How thoroughly this settlement had already become a place where people simply lived, rather than a camp where a wounded species waited anxiously for news from a council that had cast them aside. Nathan, standing nearby, told me quietly that this was precisely the point his people had been trying to make for 60 years. They had never wanted conflict. They had only ever wanted the simple, ordinary dignity of building a life without needing anyone's permission to matter. Later that evening, before we retired to our quarters, Nathan invited Soren and me to a small gathering of compact administrators discussing the settlement's expansion plans for the coming year. I listened as they debated funding for a new medical training academy, a shared research initiative with the Synthetic Collective, and a proposed trade agreement with a distant mining consortium that had never before been permitted formal contact with any council delegation. None of it was designed with the council in mind at all. It existed entirely on its own terms, growing steadily, deliberately, without waiting for anyone's approval. That night, alone in the small guest quarters the settlement had prepared for our delegation, I opened the old council archive files again, the ones I had reviewed during our journey, and I began reading them differently than I had before. I no longer saw a list of proposals and rejections. I saw a slow, patient pattern of dismissal, repeated so many times, across so many years, that it had become invisible to everyone except the people it was happening to. I thought about the laughter in the council chamber the day Elena Ward resigned. I thought about Councillor Vantorio's dismissive words and how confidently he had predicted that humanity's absence would barely register within a single council cycle. I began drafting a report that night, though I knew even as I wrote it that most of the council would not want to hear what it said. I wrote that humanity's departure was not a temporary tantrum to be waited out. I wrote that it was the direct, foreseeable result of 60 years of quiet disrespect dressed up as caution. I wrote that if the council wished to survive the coming years, it would need to change far more than its assumptions about a single species. It would need to change the entire architecture of how it treated anyone it considered smaller than itself. Soren read the draft over my shoulder and asked quietly whether I intended to actually submit something so critical of the council's own history. I told him yes, because for the first time in 3 centuries of service, I had realized that protecting the council's comfort was no longer the same thing as protecting its survival. I did not know then how quickly that survival would come under threat, or how soon I would need every word of that report simply to be believed. The first cracks in the council's foundation appeared exactly 6 weeks after humanity's departure, and they appeared in a place I had never expected, among the founding species themselves, the elder races who had built this entire order and who had always seemed, at least on the surface, unshakable. It began with a border dispute between the Corvain Assembly and the Veyron systems, 2 founding species who had coexisted uneasily for nearly 2,000 years. Their old rivalries kept in careful balance by generations of council mediation. For as long as anyone could remember, that mediation had quietly relied on a rotating panel of neutral observers, and for the past 40 years, human diplomats had filled the majority of those neutral seats, precisely because humanity had no ancient grudges, no old debts, no inherited resentments toward either side. Without human mediators available, the council scrambled to assemble a replacement panel from among the remaining founding species. Every species they approached, however, had some ancient history with either the Corvain or the Veyron, some old alliance or old grievance that made their neutrality immediately suspect to one side or the other. Within days, what should have been a minor territorial disagreement over a single mining outpost escalated into something far more dangerous. Accusations flew across the council chamber. Old treaties, some centuries old, were suddenly reopened and re-examined. Councillor Threl Vantorio, who had once so confidently dismissed humanity's importance, now stood before the assembly, demanding to know why no acceptable mediator could be found, as if the answer were not staring the entire chamber directly in the face. I sat through that session in growing disbelief, watching delegates who had spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of careful diplomatic language suddenly reduced to the same old accusations and grievances that human mediators had spent decades quietly smoothing over. It was like watching a dam crack after the engineers who had maintained it simply walked away. I requested permission to speak, and the council granted it, though I sensed from the impatient shifting among the elder benches that they expected another lecture they did not wish to hear. I told them plainly that the panel of neutral mediators had never been neutral by accident. It had been neutral because humanity had spent decades earning that neutrality through patient, careful, thankless work, the same work the council had refused to formally recognize or compensate. I told them that the very stability they now realized they were missing had been humanity's quiet gift to this council for 40 years, offered freely and repaid with condescension. I told them, finally, that if they wished to resolve the Corvain-Veyron dispute, they would need to ask humanity for help, and they would need to ask honestly, without the old assumption that humanity owed them anything. The chamber fell into an uncomfortable silence after I finished speaking. Some delegates looked away. Councillor Vantorio's expression tightened into something between anger and humiliation, though he said nothing in response. It was Councillor Grace Whitfield, a Veyron elder who had long served as the council's chief archivist, who finally broke the silence. She stood slowly, her ancient posture betraying the weight of the moment, and said that pride had cost the council more in 6 weeks than 60 years of careful diplomacy had ever managed to preserve. She said she, for one, was tired of watching that pride cost innocent lives. I had known Councillor Whitfield for over a century, and I had always respected her quiet, careful manner, though I had also long assumed her caution meant she would never openly challenge the council's more traditional members. That day taught me otherwise. After the session ended, she asked me to walk with her through the archive halls she had overseen for so long, and she told me she had spent decades cataloging the council's founding documents without ever truly examining what those documents had come to mean in practice. She said reading my report had forced her to confront a history she had always assumed belonged to someone else's failure, some earlier generation's mistake, rather than her own quiet complicity. She said she did not know yet how to fix what had been broken, but she knew she could no longer pretend it had not happened. I asked her directly whether she believed the Corvain-Veyron dispute could still be resolved without a return to human mediation. She was honest with me, in a way few council elders had ever been. She said she did not know, and that uncertainty, more than anything else, was what finally convinced her the council needed to change. Her words did not end the debate that day, but they cracked something open that had been sealed shut since the day humanity walked out of that chamber. Over the following weeks, the fractures only deepened. 3 smaller founding species, long overshadowed by the Corvain and Veyron blocks, began quietly forming their own alliance, uncertain whether the council could still guarantee their protection without the balancing presence humanity had once provided. Rumors spread of entire star systems considering independence, following the precedent humanity had set. The council's emergency response network, already weakened by the loss of human relief convoys, buckled further under a second, unrelated crisis, a resource shortage on the outer mining colonies that no single founding species had the logistics network to address alone. I traveled personally to one of those mining colonies during this period, at Councillor Whitfield's request, to assess the situation firsthand and report back to the Assembly. The colony's administrator, a weary Dravon elder named Edward Lang, walked me through storage depots that should have been full and were instead nearly empty, their usual resupply schedule thrown into chaos by the same logistical gaps opening up across council territory. He told me, without any attempt to soften the truth, that his people had 2 months of reserves left, and no clear plan for what would happen after that. I asked him what he believed the council should do. He said quietly that he no longer expected the council to solve this on its own. He said he had already sent private inquiries to the Sol Compact, asking whether independent trade arrangements might be possible, arrangements that did not depend on the council's increasingly fragile logistics network at all. He did not seem ashamed to admit this. He seemed, if anything, relieved to finally say it aloud. I returned to the capital with his words weighing heavily on me, understanding now that the Council's crisis was no longer simply about humanity's absence. It was about a slow, spreading loss of faith among the very founding species who had built this order in the first place, a quiet realization spreading from colony to colony that the Council could no longer be relied upon the way it once had been. I submitted my report during this period, the one I had begun drafting in the guest quarters of New Haven weeks earlier. I expected resistance, perhaps even formal reprimand for daring to criticize the Council's own history so openly. Instead, I found an assembly far more willing to listen than I had anticipated, not because they had suddenly grown wise, but because reality had grown too loud to ignore any longer. Before the report reached the full assembly, I was summoned to a private meeting with 3 senior delegates who wished to review its contents in advance, concerned about the political consequences of releasing such a document to the wider chamber. One of them, an elder from a species that had long allied itself closely with the Corvain bloc, asked me directly whether I understood that publishing such criticism might permanently damage the standing of several respected founding members, including Councillor Vantorio himself. I told him that I understood the risk perfectly well, but that I had come to believe protecting reputations mattered far less than preventing further loss of life, and that the choice, as I saw it, was no longer between comfort and disruption, but between honesty now or a much larger reckoning later. The 3 delegates did not fully agree with me that day, but they did not block the report from reaching the assembly either. I have wondered often, since then, whether their hesitation came from genuine reflection or simply from the growing recognition that the crisis had already grown too large for quiet management. I suspect it was some uneasy mixture of both. Councillor Whitfield read portions of my report aloud during a closed session, portions detailing the quiet rejection of humanity's proposals over the years, the repeated dismissal of their contributions, the unclaimed labor that had propped up the Council's daily function without recognition or reward. I watched delegates who had once laughed at Elena Ward's resignation now sit in uncomfortable silence, forced to reckon with a history they had never bothered to examine honestly while it was still happening around them. It was during this same period that I made a decision I knew would cost me standing among the Council's more traditional members. I requested unofficial leave to return to Sol Space, not as a Council representative, but simply as myself, Veltharion Osk, a diplomat who had spent 3 centuries defending an institution he was only now beginning to fully understand. Soren asked me why I felt the need to go in person rather than simply submitting further reports through official channels. I told him that some conversations cannot be conducted through documents and formal proceedings. Some conversations require a person to stand before another person and simply say, honestly and without the protection of rank or title, that they were wrong, and that they are sorry, and that they hope it is not too late to build something better. I did not know, as my shuttle departed Council space for the second time, whether Elena Ward or anyone in the Sol Compact would even agree to see me. I only knew that I could no longer sit comfortably in that chamber, watching the consequences of decades of quiet disrespect unfold, without at least attempting to say the words that should have been said long before humanity ever felt the need to walk away. Soren met me at the departure gate before the shuttle left, carrying a small data drive containing the full 11-page list of quiet, unclaimed human labor he had compiled weeks earlier. He told me he wanted me to bring it with me, not as evidence for further argument, but as a reminder, in case I needed one during the difficult conversation ahead, of exactly why this journey mattered. I took it from him gratefully, and I carried it the entire 19 days back to Sol Space. Though I never once needed to open it, I simply knew it was there. Elena Ward met me this time, not in a garden, but in a small, unassuming office overlooking the growing skyline of New Haven, a skyline that had, in the month since my last visit, grown taller and busier, new towers rising alongside older ones, new ships arriving daily from species I recognized and species I did not. She did not seem surprised that I had come, though she did seem surprised, briefly, when I told her I had come without any official council mandate, simply as myself. I told her everything I had witnessed since our last conversation, the Corvain-Veyron dispute spiraling out of control without neutral mediation, the resource crisis on the outer mining colonies, worsened by the absence of human logistics networks, the growing fractures among founding species who had never before questioned the Council's stability, now suddenly uncertain whether that stability could survive without the quiet labor humanity had provided for decades. I told her about my report, about Councillor Whitfield reading it aloud in closed session, about the uncomfortable silence that had followed. I told her that for the first time in 3 centuries, I had watched the Council's oldest members forced to confront a history they had always assumed was someone else's fault. Then I told her the reason I had truly come. I told her I was sorry, not on behalf of the Council, not as an official apology meant to smooth over a diplomatic crisis, but as myself, as someone who had sat in that chamber for 300 years and never once raised his voice when it mattered most. Elena listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the skyline through her window. She told me that an apology mattered, but that it was not, on its own, enough. She said humanity had not left the Council because they wanted an apology. They had left because they wanted to build a life where their contributions were valued from the beginning, rather than acknowledged only after their absence caused enough damage to force a reckoning. She told me about the Sol Compact's growth, about the alliances forming with species the Council had long dismissed, about the synthetic collective now building their first permanent settlements alongside human colonies, about smaller species finding, for the first time, genuine partners rather than reluctant patrons. She said the Compact was not interested in revenge. She said it was not interested in watching the Council collapse simply to prove a point. But she said it was also not interested in returning to an arrangement built on patience and quiet suffering, no matter how urgently the Council now needed that arrangement restored. She asked me a direct question. She asked what, exactly, the Council was prepared to offer that it had never been willing to offer before. I did not have a perfect answer for her that day, but I told her what I believed, honestly, based on everything I had witnessed in the weeks since my report. I told her that the crisis had forced open a conversation the Council had avoided for 60 years, a conversation about founding status, about equal representation, about recognizing labor and contribution rather than simply tolerating it. I told her that Councillor Whitfield and a growing number of delegates were now genuinely willing to discuss a new charter, one that did not treat humanity, or any other species, as a junior partner waiting patiently for permission to matter. Elena studied my face for a long moment, as if searching for something she needed to be certain of before she allowed herself to hope. Then she told me she would bring my message to the Compact's leadership, not as a promise of return, but as an invitation to talk, on equal footing, about what a new relationship between the Council and the Compact might actually look like. She also told me before I left her office that day about a young woman named Grace Bellamy, one of the Compact's newest recruits, who had grown up on a Council colony hearing stories about humanity's departure only from the elder generation's bitter recollections, and who had crossed half the galaxy alone to join the Compact once she came of age. Drawn by nothing more than a rumor that somewhere out among the stars, a community existed that judged people by what they built, rather than by what species they were born into. Elena said stories like that arrived more often than I might expect. Quiet individual choices, adding up slowly, into something that no Council vote could easily undo. I asked her whether she worried the Compact might grow too quickly, taking in more people and more responsibility than it could steadily support. She admitted the concern was real, and told me that growth without care could easily become its own kind of failure, the very mistake the Council itself had made for centuries. She said the Compact's leadership met weekly specifically to guard against that danger, determined not to repeat, in their own way, the same quiet neglect they had spent 60 years enduring. I returned to Council space 3 days later, carrying that message like something fragile I was afraid to drop. The Council session that followed was unlike any I had witnessed in 3 centuries of service. Councillor Whitfield proposed, formally, the creation of a joint commission between the Council and the Sol Compact, tasked with drafting an entirely new charter, one built not on hierarchy but on genuine partnership. Councillor Vantorio, to his credit, did not block the proposal, though he did not support it warmly either. He simply sat in silence as the vote passed, the first vote in Council history to formally acknowledge that the old order could not continue as it had. The Commission's early sessions were difficult. Old habits of condescension surfaced more than once, and more than once, human and synthetic and smaller species representatives had to firmly, patiently, remind the Council's elder members that this was not a negotiation for permission, but a genuine discussion between equals. I sat through those sessions as an observer, sometimes as a mediator, watching centuries of assumption slowly, painfully give way to something new. Sophie Marsh, the engineer I had met in New Haven's training yard, joined the Commission as a technical representative during its third month, tasked with outlining what fair recognition for infrastructure labor should actually look like in practice. I watched her sit calmly through an early session where a Corvain elder suggested that human engineers should simply be grateful for the opportunity to contribute to Council infrastructure at all, regardless of compensation. She did not raise her voice. She simply asked the elder, plainly, whether he would accept the same arrangement for his own people, unpaid labor for decades, with no formal recognition, and let the silence that followed answer the question for her. Not every session ended so evenly. During the fifth month of negotiations, a serious dispute nearly collapsed the entire process when Councillor Vantorio, still resistant despite his earlier silence, proposed that any new charter preserve a permanent advisory council of founding species with final authority over disputed votes, effectively recreating the old hierarchy under a different name. The Sol Compact delegation, led on that day by Nathan Pierce, refused outright, and for 3/10 days the Commission's work halted entirely, while both sides retreated to separate chambers to consider whether the entire effort was doomed to fail. It was Councillor Whitfield who finally broke the standoff, traveling personally to the Compact's temporary quarters within Council space to speak with Nathan directly, without aides, without formal protocol, simply two people trying to find a way forward. I was not present for that conversation, but Whitfield told me afterward that she had asked Nathan a single question: whether the Compact would accept a charter that guaranteed equal votes for every founding member, regardless of species, with no permanent advisory council at all, only rotating oversight committees drawn from the full assembly. Nathan had agreed, on the condition that the first oversight committee include at least as many Compact representatives as council elders, a condition Whitfield brought back to the assembly and fought to pass over Vantorio's continued objections. The vote to remove the permanent advisory council from the draft charter passed by a narrow margin, and Vantorio did not attend the session where it was announced. He resigned his seat quietly 2 weeks later, citing personal reasons, though everyone in the chamber understood the true reason well enough. I felt no satisfaction in his departure. I had spent 3 centuries beside him, and I understood, watching him go, that he was not a cruel person, simply a person who had never been asked to question the comfort his position afforded him until it was already too late to adjust. It took nearly a full year before the joint charter was finally ready for ratification. I will not pretend the process was smooth, or that every founding species embraced the change with open arms. Some resented it deeply, quietly predicting failure, longing for the old order where their comfort had never been questioned. But enough had changed, enough had been lost and rebuilt, that the vote finally passed. I remember the exact moment the final vote count was read aloud in the temporary chamber where the Commission had met for that entire difficult year. The count passed by a wider margin than any of us had expected, and when the result was announced, there was no laughter this time, no dismissive murmurs from the elder benches. There was simply a long, heavy silence, followed by something I had never once heard in 3 centuries of council service. A quiet, genuine round of applause that included every species present, elder and young alike, rising together for the first time as something closer to equals. Edward Lang, The young Veyron delegate who had once asked why the council never built a redundant relief network, stood near the back of that chamber during the vote, and I noticed him quietly wiping his eyes when the count was finalized. He told me afterward that he had joined council service believing the institution already represented the best of what cooperation between species could achieve, and that watching it nearly collapse, only to be rebuilt through honest reckoning rather than empty pride, had taught him more about genuine partnership than a decade of formal training ever had. The agricultural delegation that had once asked me whether their people should quietly prepare for a future outside the council sent a formal message shortly after the charter's ratification, informing me that they had chosen, for now, to remain within the reformed assembly, encouraged by the new oversight structure and the guaranteed equal vote it promised. Their senior representative added, in a personal note attached to the formal message, that she remained watchful and that trust, once broken, would need to be proven again through action for many years before it could ever be taken for granted the way it once had been. I thought that was a fair position, and I told her so in my reply. The day the new assembly convened for the first time, I stood at the edge of the great hall, a hall newly built to reflect the compact's influence alongside the council's old traditions, wide-open windows replacing ancient stone walls, a design Elena Ward herself had helped select. She stood beside me that day, both of us older than we had been the day she walked out of the old chamber, both of us carrying the weight of everything that had happened in between. The outpost that had once buried 42 colonists in ash now stood rebuilt with joint council and compact funding. The Corvain-Veyron border dispute had finally been resolved through a mediation panel that included, for the first time, members from 3 different smaller species alongside human representatives, a model the Assembly hoped to use for every future dispute. Elena told me she still felt regret when she thought about the lives lost during those difficult months, the colonists who died waiting for help that should have arrived sooner, the years wasted on old pride and older assumptions. I told her I felt that same regret every single day, and that I suspected I always would. Nathan Pierce joined us a while later, along with Sophie Marsh, who had been formally appointed that very morning to lead the new Joint Infrastructure Office, a position that came with a proper salary, a permanent staff, and a formal vote on the Assembly's Technical Committee. Everything her years on the Corvain relay had once been denied. She told me she still could not quite believe it, that after everything, the recognition had finally come not as an apology, but as an ordinary, unremarkable fact of how the new assembly simply operated now. Councillor Grace Whitfield found us near the end of that first session as well, moving slower than she once had, the weight of the past year visible in her posture, though her expression carried something lighter than I had seen in her for a very long time. She told me she had spent decades archiving the council's history without ever truly reading it, and that the past year had been the first time in her long life she had actually understood the institution she served. She said she did not know how many more years she had left to serve on this new assembly, but she was grateful to see its first session with her own eyes. I thought, standing there among all of them, about Soren, who had chosen to remain in council service rather than pursue the private career many young Cathari of his generation now sought within the growing compact economy. He told me once, during the long year of negotiations, that he wanted to help build the very thing I had once failed to build for Elena Ward's generation. I did not tell him then how much that meant to me. I tell it to whoever will listen now. But she also told me she felt something else now, something she had not been sure she would ever feel again when she walked out of that old chamber. She told me she felt hope, real hope, built not on patience or waiting, but on the hard-won understanding that respect between different peoples cannot simply be assumed. It has to be built, deliberately, honestly, and it has to be earned again every single day. I think of that conversation often now, standing at the edge of this new hall, watching representatives from a dozen different species take their seats as genuine equals for the first time in council history. I think about Elena Ward's face the day she resigned, and the laughter that followed her out the door, and the silence that came after, and everything that silence eventually taught us. We did not lose a council seat when humanity left. We lost the comfortable illusion that we were irreplaceable, that patience and quiet suffering could be asked of others indefinitely without consequence. And in losing that illusion, painfully, slowly, through crisis and regret and difficult honest conversation, I believe we finally became worthy of sitting beside them, not above them, not ahead of them, but truly, finally beside them. That is the story I carry with me now, into every new session of this assembly, into every difficult conversation still ahead of us. A galaxy built on regret for everything we nearly lost, and hope for everything we are only now, finally, beginning to build together.